The Hudson Library and Historical Society's Through the Eyes of the Artist biographical series presents art historian Felicia Zavarella Stadelman speaking about French artist Hilaire Germain Edgar Degas. Recorded at the Hudson Library's Flood Meeting Room on November 13, 2014.
I would like to welcome back Felicia Zavarella Stadelman as she presents her series of artist biographical lectures Through the Eyes of the Artist. Tonight she will present Edgar Degas, the artist who refused or had a difficult time parting with his work. So we're anxious to hear about him. Thank you.
I feel so special standing up here on the... I can see all of you now. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you braving the cold. I'm not really ready for winter. The career of Edgar Degas was a long one, about 60 years. Out of the 83 years in which he lived, he was an artist. And his style, unlike that of many of the other famous artists who worked until their old age, never ceased developing. He was always seeking out a new means of expression and technique and trying different things. His name was Hilaire Germain Edgar Degas. D-E, lowercase d-e, capital G-A-S. It was only after he became a little more famous that he started signing it as all one word. He was born in Paris on the 19th of July, 1834. He was the eldest of three boys and two girls born to a prosperous banker's family, a Neapolitan family. His father's name was Auguste, and his mother was Creole, and she was from New Orleans. And her name was Celestine. He was actually named after his grandfathers. Hilaire Degas was an extremely wealthy banker from Naples, and Germain Mousson was a New Orleans merchant, also very wealthy. And the two men had powerful personalities, and they had a great deal of influence on Edgar Degas as a child. However, the deepest sorrow that Edgar Degas carried throughout his life was the loss of his mother. She died when he was only 13 years old. Whoops, went too far here. My apologies. So she died when he was only 13, and even before his mother died, he had a very unhappy childhood with her. His mother married his father when she was only 17 years old. She was very unhappy. It was an arranged marriage, and she would often complain to young Edgar about the exploits of his father. His father was out of the house most of the time. He preferred the company of other women, is what he told his son, many other women, to his wife. And he was often at the local cafes playing piano, hanging around with his musician friends, just kind of leaving his family behind. Now, his father, despite his wild lifestyle, considered himself a member of the aristocracy, although many of his companions were not. He did, however, try to influence his children into a more cultural life by visiting museums and galleries and opera houses, even if it was just to meet up with his buddies. Edgar was educated at a very famous school for the elite, where he received a classical education. He got his bachelor's degree in 1853. He passed a very difficult exam to do so, an exam that very few Frenchmen succeeded at passing. He was a very intelligent young man, and he eventually enrolled in law school to please his father. His father wanted him to become an attorney. He preferred, however, to spend his time at the Louvre copying paintings. Now, his father recognized after his first term in office that maybe he really didn't want to be an attorney, and that his son was not doing it because he wanted him to. He was doing it because his father wanted him to, and he knew that his real passion was art. So in 1855, his father pulled a few strings and entered Edgar into the most prestigious art school in Paris, which was l'École des Beaux-Arts, and he began to study officially the French classical academic painters of the time. But Edgar Degas was not happy there either. He said, I dislike the tense and competitive atmosphere of the classes, and he preferred his solitude. He told his father he was not interested in meeting other people with the same interests. He just wanted to focus on himself. He preferred private lessons, and his father gladly paid for them. So for 2 years, the very shy, very sensitive, and extremely serious Edgar Degas applied himself to his studies. He had very few friends, and he said, I prefer it that way. Now, not needing to study to compete for the Grand Prix de Rome, which was a state grant that enabled artists who won to travel through Europe and study, in 1856, because he had a pretty big bankroll with his grandfathers and his father, at 22 years old, he set out for Italy on his own, first visiting his family in Naples, and then he went to Capodimonte. He passed his summers at the enormous villa of his grandfather, and his winters, he was touring the countryside. Edgar Degas said these were the happiest times of his life. He was free, he was independent of his very controlling family, and he had no shortage of funds. In October of 1857, he visited Rome, where he met Moreau, who was already an influential art figure, 8 years older than Edgar Degas. And although Degas resisted, you could tell from the number of letters that he wrote to his father, they did become close friends, and they visited Florence together between June and August of 1858. Periodically, Edgar Degas, at the request of his father, would send paintings home to show his father that he was progressing along and studying, to just kind of keep him satisfied, but more importantly, to keep the money coming. This was the portrait that he sent back and forth to his father. It's called Bellini Family Portrait, and it was a painting that Degas worked on for the full 2 years while he was studying in Italy. It was found many years after he had died, rolled up in a corner of his dusty studio. He never mentioned this painting, he never submitted it for exhibition, he never showed it to anyone, including his friends. He only used it as a method for his father to measure how well he was doing. So he returns to Paris in 1859. He was 25 years old, and he was going to set up a studio in the Rue Laval, which was the quarter where he was born. About not even a block away from where he was born, he set up a studio. And he began painting some very ambitious historical canvases, which were particularly well received. Semiramis was the queen of ancient Syria, and she was celebrated for her beauty as well as her cruelty. Degas was particularly interested in women, stories of women who were kind of femme fatales. And generally, when he did historic paintings, he reproduced those images in his work. In these works, he attempted to take a fresh look at historical painting, which he considered to have been, in his words, suffocated by the stereotypes of the Salon's requests. This is another painting that he did, Spartan Girls Challenging the Boys. Now, historical subjects were very popular for art buyers at the time, and he quickly established a number of clients that were in the French art circles, influential people who were interested in buying his work. But because he didn't really suffer any financial difficulties like his contemporaries did, he preferred to not sell his paintings. He wasn't quite ready to sell the work that he was doing at this time. And his studio became cluttered with piles of finished and unfinished paintings. He refused to submit to the Salon, nor would he ever consider selling any of his paintings. So at 30 years old, his father writes a letter to him and says, "What exactly is your goal?" Now, in 1862, Degas meets Edward Manet, who preferred themes of modern life rather than traditional subject matter of history and religion. He was also an artist who was not interested in submitting his work to the Salon. The Salon was that great glass-roofed exhibition hall in the center of Paris where all of the artists wanted to have their works accepted by these juries to hopefully to gain exposure and have somebody interested in buying their art. And since Edgar Degas did not want to be criticized by anyone, nor did he really want to sell any of his artwork, he didn't really care about submitting his work to the Salon. And Edward Manet was a little controversial at the time, and he was not interested in submitting his work. So the two of them joined together, were drawn together for that very reason. Degas preferred painting modern life to the traditional subject matter of history and religion, what the academic the academic classical artists of the time were interested in. And Edgar Degas was so transformed by these ideas of painting contemporary life that he decides to abandon the whole historical genre altogether around 1866 when he was 32 years old. And he starts painting a little bit more like the inspiration he got from Edward Manet. His first painting is called Madame Manet at the Piano. Around this time, he also meets a novelist by the name of Edmond Duranty, who passionately believed in realism and wanted to remove the barrier between life and art. Degas and Manet snobbishly avoided the cafes where many of the other artists associated. The independent artists regularly met in these cafes, and they associated themselves with Duranty and became kind of a small group of independent artists themselves. Degas and Manet felt that the artists and the writers of the Paris cafes were bohemians, in Degas' words, trying to change the world of arts to include passion and emotion. That was something that Edgar Degas did not feel very close to. Both Edward Manet and Edgar Degas felt that paintings should avoid passion and emotion, and you should only paint what you see before you. His art of the late 1860s reflects a change in his views in this idea of not incorporating emotions into your painting. Now, Manet convinced Edgar Degas to submit his work to the Salon because now Manet was starting to feel like he wanted to gain some exposure and wanted some potential buyers to view his work. So he submits a canvas called the Luncheon, the Luncheon in the upper right-hand corner, and it was immediately rejected by the Salon. The reason it was rejected is because it displayed women that were naked and not nude. If you were nude, there were no clothes there to put on. We were just painting the beauty of the body in its natural state. But if you're naked, there's a pile of clothes over there next to their picnic. And you either just took them off or you should have put them back on. So it was considered to be very scandalous at the time. The other painting that was rejected by the Salon was the one that was submitted by Edgar Degas for obvious reasons. It feels a little possibly incestuous. Makes you very uncomfortable. They figured it was scandalous, and the jury of the Salon, who was very interested in the traditional styles of painting, felt that these two paintings scandalized polite society, so they were rejected. Manet turned out to be the scandal of the Independence exhibition as well. He decided to show his work with the independent artists, and they were a little outraged about the nakedness of these women as well. But they were drawn to Manet because of the controversy surrounding this painting. The rejection of these two paintings is what seemed to bring the bohemian independent artists that were hanging out in the cafes talking about a climate of revolt against art with these two artists who were now rejected by the Salon, Edgar Degas and Edward Manet. And together with Monet, Cézanne, Auguste Renoir, and Pissarro, they were all shocked as well at Manet's paintings, but they all agreed that they had one common thought, which was experimentation was the basis for change. And that's what drew this group of artists together. So Manet, who was now folded into this group of independent artists because of the controversy around his painting, now brings Edgar Degas to meet his friends. They met regularly at the cafes. Manet was often the center of attention because now he was kind of the leader of this rebel group. He was witty and self-assured about his new way of thinking. He often stirred conversation, he said, into a boisterous exchange just to see what thoughts might come out. Degas was very hot-tempered, and Manet would limit him to a few carefully chosen words that they would talk about ahead of time. And soon, Edgar Degas developed a reputation for always having sharp and cutting remarks. But he did now start to enjoy the activities of the New Paris, but he rarely admitted it. His subjects at this time showed a more relaxed side of Edgar Degas. This is Lorenzo Pagans, and Auguste Renoir is in the background, his father. So now he tries to adapt to the style of this new independent group of artists. They were painting outdoors. They felt that the only way that you could capture what was before your eyes was to paint directly from life. But Edgar Degas thought this was an appalling notion. He was controlled, he was methodical. He felt, in his words, that it was better to train from memory than from working from real life. And he said, working from memory, you only reproduce what has struck you, what is essential. It's the way your memory and your imagination are liberated from the tyranny that nature holds over them. Besides, Edgar Degas liked to work in solitude, distant from his subjects and mostly distant from the other artists. His paintings often look as though you are peeking through the keyhole at a scene that you're not supposed to be a part of. You're certainly not an active participant like Pierre Renoir was. Pierre Renoir would enjoy the food and the merriment and drink the wine and dance with the women. And when he got to know everyone, he would set up his little easel and he would paint them. Edgar Degas was in the distance. The paintings that he did almost made you feel like you shouldn't be there. You certainly weren't a participant in the scene. And he writes about this in his letters. Edgar Degas said, these landscapists, is what he called the independent artists, are tromping out into the countryside like a bunch of hikers. Don't tell me about those fellows cluttering the fields with their easels. I would like to have the authority to order the police to shoot down every one of them. Those stupid fools crouching over there with their stupid shields of white canvas. He just didn't like the idea of painting outdoors. His subject matter was now concerned with everyday life, but not everyday life that he participated in. He would consult a drawing from one of his sketchbooks. He would refer to another sketchbook for details, and then he would methodically assemble all of the parts into a complete composition. And then he would withdraw to the controlled environment of his studio and compose his work, as opposed to Monet, who wanted to complete a painting before the sun went down. This was Degas' realism, to paint what he saw around him, but to do it from a carefully orchestrated distance. For his entire life, Degas was a keen and sensitive observer, but he was always removed. Being distant from his subject suited his personality. He was an isolated, very private man. He had decided very early on that he did not need the company of others. Now you can imagine the years that he had of adolescence spent in contact with a widower father, 2 widower grandfathers, 4 bachelor uncles that didn't really encourage any inclination to have a woman in his life, let alone to get married. And he knew the difficulties that his mother had with his father. There were times, he said, when he would question his decision not to marry, but he would say, you have no idea the loneliness you feel as you grow older. But he would quickly talk himself out of those thoughts. He was, however, unhappy about being alone and wrote about it constantly. But at the same time, he said, I realized that because of the conditions under which I lived, I was not cut out for the worries of family life. He said he envied some of his friends who were surrounded by happy families, but his imagination would raise 100 objections against the slightest wish to marry. He said, if ever my thoughts went farther than a vague sadness over being deprived of the joys not made for me, I would quickly change my thoughts. In any event, there was a more important incentive to bachelorhood that was found in the notion that was widespread among many French anti-bourgeois intellectuals around the end of the Second Empire, And that was these words that was written kind of as a mantra, that a wife was likely to weaken physically an artist's creative powers, or hamper them by trivial henpecking criticism, or divert them into boring but disastrously safe channels. According to Degas, again in his writings, he said, celibacy was the only state that left artists with their liberty, their strength, their brains, and their conscience. He had a feeling that it was because of wives that so many artists slipped into what he called weaknesses, complacency, concessions of profit-making and commerce, into denials of aspirations, sad desertion of the disinterestedness of their vocation, and into a hasty, botched sort of industrial production for the sake of the money. And he said mothers of families shamelessly sweated out their talented husbands. He was very proud of the fact that he was kind of a misogynist. He said in marriage eventually evolved into paternity, which he considered to be, in his words, harmful to the artist because it turned them away from things of the mind and attached them to an inferior kind of creation and degraded them into bourgeois pride in fleshy property. However, many other artists felt the same way during this time. Corot, for example, had pronounced that good landscape painting was incompatible with marriage. The usually reserved Delacroix had once lost his temper with a young disciple who was thinking about taking a wife, and he said, if you love her and she's pretty, then the situation is worse. Your art is dead. An artist must have no passion except for his work, and he must sacrifice everything to do it. Manet did not marry Suzanne until 1863, by the time their son was 11 years old. Renoir, well, we know about Renoir and his women. I think I could do an entire hour's presentation about Renoir and his women, but you'd have to show your IDs at the door. He lived with a model by the name of Lise from 1865 to 1872. He had a series of mistresses during the next several years, including Suzanne Valadon, who was an artist model that he wound up having a child with, who became Maurice Utrillo. You remember that story, I'm sure. Although he lived with Alina Chargot from 1879 and finally married her in 1890 when he was 49, and their first of 3 children was 5 years old. The anarchist Pissarro began an affair with his mother's maid, Julie, in 1858. He had a son by her in 1863, a daughter in 1865. He made her his legal wife in 1870 when he was 39, just before she gave birth to their 3rd child, and he writes, very reluctant to do so. Monet was probably the only one that was dedicated to both of the women in his life. He began a liaison with Camille in 1863, married her just before the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, when their first son was 3 years old, and then after her death he eventually married the woman who nursed her, took care of her. So it was kind of a general consensus that women were kind of interfering with an artist's opportunities. Now, it was during the 1870s, at the age of 36, that Degas acquired the enduring reputation as the painter of dancers. The reasons for his interest in dance were numerous and diverse, but certainly it had a lot to do with his lifelong interest in music. His father always brought him to the ballet, to the opera, to dance halls. While serving in the Franco-Prussian War, however, a more important reason brought him into the rehearsal halls and into the ballet. Edgar Degas developed an infection in his eye that never cleared up. And it was after his return from the war that he began his interest in painting the ballet. Many art historians feel that his worsening eyesight forced him into the opera houses where the light was more direct and he could see more clearly. Also, the possibility of unusual views from the stage or from the balconies, from the orchestral pit, the contrast between light and darkness, illusion and reality. He said the contrast between beauty and predictability. He also could keep his distance without having to really talk to any of his models because they were there. He seemed to be as interested also in the effects of artificial light as the other Impressionists were interested in the effects of natural life. And he painted an uncounted number of ballet scenes. After the theme of dance, it was the racehorse that drew most of his attention, and an inventory of his work shows a theme that he dedicated more than 145 paintings to the idea of the racehorse, 20 pastels, 250 sketches, and 17 sculptures. When people would ask him why he painted the same things over and over, he said, "Art does not expand, it simply repeats itself." Also, racehorses were a relatively new phenomenon in France. It was introduced there from England in the 19th century, and the Luncheon Stadium opened in 1857 as part of the plans for the revitalization of the city, and it of course inspired Edgar Degas, Manet, Toulouse-Lautrec, for example, because it had an exclusive jockey club that only the wealthy could attend. And it kept Edgar Degas, who was very interested and concerned about social levels, milieu, it kept him separate from the bourgeois independent artists that were making some noise in the background. And being part of the jockey club inspired Toulouse-Lautrec, Manet, and Edgar Degas, which is why they painted these racehorses, you know, as if to say, I have the opportunity to do this and you really don't. So from the mid-1870s, Edgar Degas began to work increasingly with pastels, a technique that was developed somewhat ironically by a female Venetian by the name of Rosabella Carrera at the beginning of the 18th century, but it now was starting to find popularity between the artists in the independent group and the Impressionist group of artists. Eventually it started losing its popularity, but Degas liked the pastels because they were more suitable for his delicate studies. They also had a number of other advantages for him. They were much quicker to work with, and he could experiment and make changes over and over with the pastels that he couldn't do with oils. He would apply several layers of color. He would rework his subjects as often as needed. And besides the traditional pastel crayons, he would use powdered pastels that when mixed with water could be applied with a brush, and then when they dried, they looked very brittle and dry and gave him the effect that he wanted. This new technique intrigued him, but it was kind of short-lived. In 1874, when Edgar Degas approached his 40th birthday, and yes, this is him at 40, he reached a turning point in his personal and professional life. He said, "My fragile self-worth was dealt repeated blows." What happened was in the 1870s, the aristocratic Degas family's image had started to unravel. In February of that year, his father suddenly died during a trip to Italy, and he left the family on the brink of bankruptcy. 3 years later, his brother René left his blind wife, 6 children, and a mountain of debt in Paris, and he fled to New Orleans to be with his mistress. Out of duty and out of a desire to avoid scandal, Degas stretched his meager artist's income to support his brother's family and help to cover his debt. Suddenly, Degas saw that his financial security and his aristocratic stability and status was now slipping away. He always knew that his father disliked the banking business, but he had no idea what his father was doing and that he had let the business fall into bankruptcy. His brother added to their financial crisis by borrowing even more money from his father's failing business to start a wine importing business, which also failed. Edgar Degas knew that the only way to save his family's business and their honorable name was to take responsibility for the financial burden. It was a debt that took him over 20 years to repay. For the first time in Edgar Degas' life, he was forced to sell his paintings, and this distressed him. He never liked selling his pictures. He said commerce is demeaning, but selling was unpleasant because now he was obligated to part with his work. He was a perfectionist. He was rarely satisfied with anything he painted. He was always retouching his work. At the National Gallery in Washington, using X-rays and infrared microscopic images, you can tell that behind many of Edgar Degas' pictures, like this one of Ida, for example, there are several different gazes. He just couldn't decide which one he wanted to settle with. He never considered a painting complete. He would often return to his work, changing it over and over and over again. When this picture was nearly finished, he wrote in his journal about her gaze and that fact that he actually scratched out the face and changed her direction entirely. Close inspection of another work reveals how he often added extra sheets of paper to pictures after he painted them. You can tell that this canvas kind of ends where the woman in the aqua jacket it ends at the end of the canvas. He actually pasted and taped a canvas to the back of it to kind of extend it and go beyond where he'd already completed it. He would always expand his compositions. There are many paintings by Edgar Degas that have pieces on the bottom, sides, and top. Owners of his work were said to have sometimes chained their paintings that they did buy to the walls to stop him from coming in, taking them down, and making changes to them. He often would buy them back just so that he could rework the canvases. After signing a painting, he'd even scrape out an entire passage and begin again rather than put it up for sale. He was actually known to buy back art for a significant profit in order to improve upon it. Now he decided, for purely financial reasons, that he had to display with the independent artists in the exhibitions of their work because now he had to sell his paintings. As it turned out, not only did he agree to display his work with theirs, but he displayed hundreds of paintings at one time, which was an opportunity for many of his paintings to be purchased because of just the sheer number. Even though the exhibits were a disappointment to the majority of the artists, Edgar Degas did become very popular with collectors, and many of his paintings were the only ones that were sold at these independent exhibitions. As his popularity in France began to grow, so did his appeal to English and American viewers. When the young MaryCassatt came to live in Paris in 1877, she was dazzled by a group of Edgar Degas pastels hanging in the window of a gallery on the boulevard. She said, "The first sign of a Degas picture was a turning point in my artistic career." Now, it would be an injustice to explore Edgar Degas' life without including MaryCassatt. That's how intertwined they were and how influential they were to each other as artists. So I just want to take just a minute to introduce you to MaryCassatt. She was born in an affluent family in Pennsylvania, May 22nd, 1844. She worked at the academy. She was hoping to gain acceptance as an artist, although she approached her parents about the idea of studying in Paris, and her father, who was a conservative banker, was not enthusiastic, and he actually wrote her a letter that said he would rather see her dead than to become an artist. But despite his initial objections, she did eventually go to Paris with her sister, Lydia, and her mother as chaperones, and that's when she saw Edgar Degas' work. He was one of the leaders of the Impressionist movement at the time. Years later, she talked about the importance of this experience. She felt that he gave her the motivation to continue on as an artist. Her subjects were contemporary. They were studies of women and children. They were an important part of this broad movement of creating contemporary paintings, and she painted the aspects of everyday life for women who generally took care of their own children, which was a very feminist thing to do at the time. She was one of the very early women's livers, if you will. This painting is very interesting. It's called Little Girl in a Blue Armchair. And she painted this canvas shortly after she met Edgar Degas. What's most interesting about it is she painted the little girl and Edgar Degas painted everything else. If you're an artist, you know that you never let anyone else touch your canvas. But they worked so well together that they often, very often, painted canvases, one on one side and one on the other, and created canvases that they completed together. Very often, MaryCassatt, incidentally, would put her names to them. He played an active role in the evolution of her painting style, and he forever changed the way she would paint. It was generally accepted that Edgar Degas would do the backgrounds on MaryCassatt's paintings, but recently they found through a lot of DNA testing, etc., that there are some paintings where Edgar Degas actually worked on the children and the women as well, which as soon as I get more information on that, I'll fill you in. But MaryCassatt was most known for persuading a very wealthy friend of hers, Louisine Havemeyer, to buy one of Edgar Degas' paintings called the Ballet Rehearsal. This was the first Impressionist painting that came to the US, and it came because of the efforts of MaryCassatt. So she is most often known for introducing Impressionism to the US, even more than the paintings of beautiful women and children. Her friend Louisine Havemeyer was very impressed with this work. She bought this painting for around $1,000. In 1965, a Havemeyer grandson resold the work for $410,000. And then somewhere in the late 80s, this particular painting was sold for $3 million. She would write to MaryCassatt and say, Degas is an artistic radical. His compositions are dynamic and jarring, unusual viewing angles, dramatic lighting, and the characters are clipped off as they drifted casually in and out of a picture. His sons are radical. They're so strange to me. Are you sure, these are the paintings you want me to buy? And MaryCassatt would reinforce her about the new style of Edgar Degas. Whether she liked it or not, she would buy anything that MaryCassatt recommended. She did write to MaryCassatt and say that she, in time, she came to understand Edgar Degas deeply and to collect him because of his unswerving intelligence and devotion. Now, Louisine Havemeyer was a woman of discriminating taste. She was very wealthy, and she would turn to MaryCassatt for guidance in assembling a collection of paintings. This was the first picture that came to America, but eventually Edgar Degas and MaryCassatt encouraged Louisine Havemeyer to collect a number of Impressionist works of art that eventually became the basis for the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, Louisine Havemeyer's collection. So for Degas and MaryCassatt, this was the beginning of a friendship and artistic relationship that lasted for 40 years. She had been accepted for 5 years in a row at the Paris Salon, but because of her admiration for Degas, he invited her to abandon the Salon, and she did so very enthusiastically and wound up showing her work with the independent artists when they could agree on an exhibition. The other thing that MaryCassatt was very well known for is she was the one who always funded the exhibitions too. Edgar Degas didn't want to part with his money. None of the other artists had any money. And so MaryCassatt was the one who kind of kept the artists going. But Edgar Degas and MaryCassatt fought regularly. She said our heated discussions fueled an intense relationship that was continually interrupted by explosive quarrels and misunderstandings, but one that proved to nourish both of us. Now, he must have felt at home with this stylish, outspoken, sharp-tongued American who reminded him very much of his family in New Orleans and the American mother of his boyhood. And in turn, she saw in Edgar Degas a possible disciple, a highly talented junior, an exotic American, he called her, and yet he said she was a fellow citizen of the same social milieu. He came from a family of bankers, and that was the same general occupation as MaryCassatt's. real estate speculating, stockbrokering father, and her corporately and socially successful brothers were something that really impressed Edgar Degas as well. Her brother Alec had married Lois Buchanan, the niece of President Buchanan, and Alexander became president of the American Railroad. Now, it's easy to see his admiration for MaryCassatt in this portrait that he paints of her. He painted her as a strong, bold woman. He said, "I elevated her to the stature of a man." When women's artist skills were being questioned, he said, "I painted her in a way that accentuated her bold and capable personality." For instance, he places her in a forward-thrusting position with her legs slightly apart, and she's resting her arms on her legs. That's not the normal female portraiture that you would see during this time. Art historians claim that he was adapting the convention of male portraiture for this representation of an unconventional woman. Edgar Degas said that he was asserting her independence and autonomy as an American woman in Paris. Artistically, socially, intellectually, they meshed, but there is absolutely no evidence that there was any sort of romantic liaison between the two. They were both independents, more affiliated with their own independence from this group of artists who were identified as the independents. MaryCassatt said, "We were both a little quirky, quick to respond to real or fancied offense." Edgar Degas said, "We were sensitive to what was due to us and what we need not accept, resentful of being put upon by anyone." Now, the similarity of their background, against to which, to some degree, they both rebelled, was also a common ground for both of them that separated them also from the independent group of artists. Both of them believed in the art of the museums. They were mistrustful of casting themselves, what they would consider to be adrift at the moment, this group of independent artists. In many ways, they were just made for each other. Their restless intelligence, MaryCassatt said, is what drew them together. And both Edgar Degas and MaryCassatt inspired and facilitated each other's career. Initially, MaryCassatt copied Edgar Degas' pastel work, but eventually Degas was duplicating her innovative style and technique by combining pastel with gouache, metallic paint on paper. She would even mix the powdered pastel with milk or oil and then paint it on, and when it would dry, it would have kind of a glossy look. Edgar Degas repeated that technique many times in his work. MaryCassatt was well aware of the crucial role that Edgar Degas played in her career. She was younger than Degas and looked to him as her mentor. Many art historians feel that she sealed her destiny as an artist by being affiliated with Edgar Degas. He was not only her teacher and her companion, but he was a highly influential painter in the art realm. And she took their friendship very seriously, even when he asked her not to submit to the salon. Now, in the 1890s, he continued to work with his favorite theme of dancers and bathers and jockeys, and his style wasn't to change too dramatically from that point on, although his subjects kind of grew and tended to expand in dimension. Whereas previously he would have a whole dance troupe, now he was accentuating and concentrating on just 2 or 3 figures. This was undoubtedly, to some extent, because of his failing eyesight, the first signs of which became apparent during the Franco-Prussian War, and that's when he turned away from oil painting into pastels. He believed that he was slowly going blind from that point on, and he was. But this did not interrupt his work. The over 2,900 paintings that he created after he started going blind were remarkable, as though his deteriorating eyesight served to increase his other senses. Pierre-Auguste Renoir said that Degas painted his best things when he couldn't see anymore. Edgar Degas gave himself another explanation for this mysterious power of his later works. He said, "It's only one thing to copy what one sees, but it's much better to draw what one can only see with one's memory. It's a transformation during which the imagination collaborates with the memory and it's liberated to its full capacity. As his eyesight worsened, he turned to sculpture, modeling small figures and horses in wax over metal. He remained what he called himself an inspired amateur when it came to sculpture. He had very little concern for the pieces that he left behind. He had improvisations, he called them, and daring experiments, but they often resulted in astonishing originality. The Little Dancer of 14, for example, is the only sculpture that Edgar Degas ever exhibited. He dressed this little girl, life-size little girl, in real slippers, stockings, and a leotard, and then he smeared a thin coating of hot wax over the clothing and added real hair, a gauze tutu, and a ribbon. This kind of unnerved the people that saw it. They weren't really sure whether there was possibly a little girl inside of there, and it was startling and unusual, and it puzzled the viewer, which is why people didn't feel so comfortable with his sculptures. After his death, however, there were about 150 pieces of sculptured wax that were discovered scattered all over his studio. They were eventually cast in bronze, rescuing the future that the artist never bothered to save himself. Just about every significant museum, except ours, has a little statue of the Degas little girl. For Degas, his studio was a retreat from society, he said, my private sanctuary to which he admitted very few people. He particularly resented visitors. He called them invasions. He particularly resented people asking him about his work. Even his good friends were rarely invited up, and when they spoke to him, he very often didn't answer them. A rare visitor to the studio marveled at a room cluttered with bathtubs and cellos and bathrobes, piano, chairs, a variety of odds and ends that he often used as his props. By the time Edgar Degas had turned 60, he had become somewhat of a celebrity. His paintings of ballerinas and racehorses were being purchased at higher prices by wealthy French and foreign collectors. He had become an idol to the next generation of artists and writers. He was always the subject of conversation when young artists met. And then he started to explore the idea and the fascination he had with photography. He even began to write some sonnets, achieving remarkable results in the sonnets and in the photography. I included one in your handout, incidentally, a sonnet that he wrote. Edgar Degas continued to struggle against his blindness and worked up until about 1912, when he was finally forced to leave his apartment. The building was being demolished and he had no other choice. He had lived there for the past quarter of a century, and he now needed to move to a better address. But his friends packed his things up, brought him to the new address, and he never unpacked them. It proved to be an ordeal that he never fully recovered from. And despite his huge international success and the high prices that he commanded for his works, from 1900 onward, he became sad and indifferent to the glory. He said, "My fame is a burden to me," and as the years passed, he became more and more bitter. He had no patience with students who sought out his company. Any form of publicity, he said, disgusted him. He said, "I simply want to be famous and unknown." Within the years, his untrimmed beard grew, his hair turned white, he became extremely eccentric. He developed a reputation for being a crank, and he liked it that way. He complained about everything. He actually enjoyed playing the part of a curmudgeon, he said. He said, "Being ornery was my method of keeping people out of my sight and encouraging them to leave me alone." He said, "I value my reputation for spitefulness and rudeness. It keeps bores at a distance." Eventually, his prejudice and his fierce temper cost him nearly all of his valued friendships. He even reduced himself to the level of being very vocal about his anti-Semitic attitudes as a means of keeping people out of his life. For Degas, anti-Semitism served as an antidote to his status anxiety, since many of the new upper class family or people were wealthy Jewish families. And as a tool to reaffirm his own aristocratic status and maintain his position, he would kind of level them. He had learned from his family that social class was more important than integrity or identity, and he turned to anti-Semitism to preserve his self-esteem. An art historian wrote, although Degas was indeed an extraordinary artist, a brilliant innovator, and one of the most important figures in the artistic vanguard of the 19th century, he was extremely insecure, unhappy about his self-imposed exile, and despaired over his loss of sight. Fueled by ignorance, anti-Semitism, this historian said, served as a shield to his fragile self-worth. But his outspokenness insulted his contemporaries, and even MaryCassatt ended her relationship with him because of it. His eyesight worsened, and he became more reclusive. In his final months, he permitted visitors to visit his dusty studio, and at these times he would withdraw into himself, go into another room, prepare in his mind what he would say to a guest, and then he would enter the room and utter his words very carefully, as if he knew that they were being recorded for future generations. On one such occasion, he complained about the art critics who had always annoyed him. He said how simple it would be if they would only leave us in peace. They bore us, and they bore the public with our works. They bore us with their articles and fine phrases. They want to explain everything, always explaining, but you can't explain anything. Beauty is a mystery. Now, unable to sustain her grudge against this nearly blind, old, angry man, MaryCassatt made arrangements for her niece to care for Edgar Degas until his death, an isolated eccentric. He died September 27th, 1917. He died during wartime, making his death going almost unnoticed by the world, perhaps a fitting end for a man who said he wanted to be famous but unknown. When his friends and family entered his studio to clear it out, they were amazed at what they discovered. His rooms were piled high with unsold paintings and early works of art that he had purchased from other artists and repurchased from people who had already bought his artwork. He was an avid collector of other artists' paintings, and on the walls, leaning against the walls, stacked in all the closets, under the beds, between the mattresses, in the ceiling rafters were hundreds of paintings that he had bought for his own personal collection. A friend of the painter wrote in 1896, Degas keeps buying, and in the evening he asks himself, how will I pay for what I bought that day? The next morning he starts again. More Ingres, more Delacroix, El Greco. And then he takes a certain pride in announcing that he can no longer afford to clothe or feed himself. Now, long before Edgar Degas had died in 1917, when he was in his mid-80s, almost totally blind, he had amassed one of the most extraordinary art collections in modern history. All in all, there were 8,000 works of art, 3,000 of them by Edgar Degas himself, many of which were entirely unknown until after his death. It took the combined efforts of Paris's 3 most important art dealers on 8 separate auctions over 18 months to dispose of the art. The headlines of the newspaper said, Degas collection sold. Another newspaper headline said, Shelling of Paris fails to interfere with Degas art sale. While the Germans bombarded Paris in 1918, curators from the National Gallery in London, the Metropolitan Museum in New York, the Louvre, and many other private collectors flocked to Paris to attend these sales. $1,700,000 in government grant was arranged for the National Gallery. whose acquisition had been suspended during the war just to buy Edgar Degas paintings. The director of the National Gallery came back with nearly 30 works of art from Ingres, Delacroix, Corot, Gauguin, Manet, Van Gogh, and others. Thanks to the steady sales of his own art, combined with his frugal lifestyle, works were acquired through trades with other artists like MaryCassatt and Paul Gauguin. He owned the original Olympia by Manet, and he also owned the Olympia by Gauguin, which those are two of the same pictures. I have to change that, I apologize. He bought Day of God, Gauguin's Day of God, one of his very famous early paintings. He also owned Van Gogh's portrait that was done by John Peter Russell. When John Peter Russell met Vincent van Gogh, Edgar Degas owned that picture, as well as sunflowers from Vincent van Gogh's private collection. From his letters, he would write, I buy, I cannot stop myself. The trouble is that people are beginning to know about my bidding and are starting to bid against me. They know when I want something, I absolutely must have it. Among the artists of previous generations, Ingres was one of the artists that he admired most. And he sought to echo the style of Ingres in his 16th and 17th century tradition. When this portrait of Monsieur Novin was for sale in 1898, Edgar Degas was so desperate to have it that he borrowed money from another friend, $23,000, to be paid off over 2 years so he could buy this painting. He also managed to acquire the original Grand Odalisque, which is in the previous picture there. He ended up owning more than 80 Ingres paintings and studies, and he said he was in search of his mastery. Much of what caught Edgar Degas' paintings, the ones that he wanted to buy as a painter, is what captured his attention as a collector. A fragment, a gesture, a detail of a face, a pose of a figure. All of these things intrigued him, and he had hoped to someday model himself after the artists that he admired. He tried to copy the works of the artists that he collected. Degas treasured Delacroix, for example. He owned 13 of his paintings, as well as paintings by Cézanne, who he had an affinity for. He began buying Cézanne in 1879 when they were still very cheap. It was only in 1895, when he was already 56 years old, that Cézanne had his first one-man show, and he actually had to go over and borrow some of the paintings from Edgar Degas to display. Degas' accumulations of works by these artists underscored his own artistic success and his own place among the masters, past and present. Buying art had become an addiction for him. He lived frugally, but he kept browsing the hotels, rummaging through shops, accompanied by friends, and he owned several works of his own art, like the interior, which was originally shunned from the salon, the song rehearsal, and After the Bath. These were all noteworthy works of art that were hidden in his mattress. Like many collectors before and after him, he had always intended to keep this collection together and set up a museum, but unfortunately it was never to be. A fortune was made from the sale of these artworks. Edgar Degas, who was never satisfied with anything he painted or collected, raised enough money from the sale of this collection to spare generations of his heirs from poverty and move them into great wealth again. For the last time, he had come to the rescue of his family. Edgar Degas, who had become virtually blind during his lifetime, visualized what other artists could not. He said, art is not a matter of what you can see, but what you make other people see. And that's the story of Edgar Degas.
Thanks to the management and staff of the Hudson Library and Historical Society for their assistance in the production of this program and for providing the Through the Eyes of the Artist series for the citizens of Hudson. For a DVD or Blu-ray copy of this or any HCTV program, contact Hudson Cable Television at 330-653-2500 or via email at hctv@hudson.oh.us.